Benjamin Zephaniah is a poet, novelist, musician, social justice activist, and human rights campaigner. His collections of poetry for young people, including Talking Turkeys and Funky Chickens, are hugely popular in schools, having important things to say, but with a playfulness that engages hearts and minds. His novels for young adults include Face, about a teenager suffering severe facial injuries as a result of a joyriding incident, Refugee, about a teenage boy from Eritrea/Ethiopia who's seeking asylum in Britain while his parents continue to fight for peace, and Teacher's Dead, which follows 15-year-old Jackson's path to uncover the seemingly motiveless murder of a teacher that he witnesses. Zephaniah's work is characterized by a search for truth, the disclosure of systemic injustice, and challenge to prejudice. Dr. Benjamin Zephaniah has a clutch of honorary doctorates, including one from his home city, Birmingham. For anyone interested in learning more, I thoroughly recommend his autobiography, which he says he wrote reluctantly, called The Life and Rhymes of Benjamin Zephaniah. Benjamin's latest book for young readers is Windrush Child, published in the Scholastic Voices series, which aims to showcase Britain's finest writers from BAME backgrounds and to throw a spotlight on the untold stories in British history. Windrush Child is the story of a 10-year-old, Leonard, who set sail for England with his mother in 1958 to join his father, one of the migrants who left Jamaica on the Empire Windrush in order to improve the prospects for his family. The story covers Leonard's life from child to old age, and it's a privilege to welcome into the reading corner today, Benjamin Zephaniah. Welcome, Benjamin.
Hello, hello, hello.
Now, I want to start, if that's okay, before the story of Windrush Child. And I wanted to talk a little bit about where Leonard comes from. He comes from Maroon Town, and I thought it was interesting that that was his hometown and perhaps not Kingston, which some of us would be more familiar with as the major town in Jamaica. Maroon Town has a really interesting history, and I thought perhaps this was a symbolic placing of Leonard. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
It was symbolic because I wanted his family to have a particular background. But before I talk about that, I'd like to say I live out in the Lincolnshire Fens in the countryside. And I remember when I was moving here from London, a lot of people were saying, well, why are you going to the countryside? Almost like it wasn't my place. And I pointed out to them that most Jamaicans, many Indians come from villages and come from the countryside. It's only when we come to places like England, we kind of dubbed inner city people. And so I found when I was young, I talked to Jamaicans and they say, yeah, we come from Kingston to make it sound cool. But actually, when you talk to them, they come from the villages. My mum's come from not far from Maroon Town, a place called St. Elizabeth, very rural, looks like Lincolnshire, actually.
Right.
But no, the Maroons are very special people because they fought against the British in Jamaica, and in Brazil, they fought against the Portuguese. The European powers tried to enslave them, but they just wouldn't. And the European powers, wherever they were, had to do treaties with them. And there were sometimes they did deals with the British that some other people didn't like. But the thing was, at least they were doing deals with the British. They just weren't subservient, they just wouldn't lie down and take it. And interestingly, the hero of the Maroons is a woman called Nanny. They call her Nanny of the Maroons. And she's on Jamaican monetary note. So they are very, very special people. So I wanted to kind of show that you may have seen Leonard and his family walking around Manchester, and they're just, another family of Jamaican immigrants, but actually they come from a long line of militant freedom fighters.
Yeah, really important. And it wasn't lost on me, the kind of significance of where he came from. The novel starts, it's in Leonard's voice, and he says, I love history. I am history. I made history. But later his father says, we shouldn't live in the past. We're here and now. We must make the most of it and move forward. I wondered how those two sentiments, which seem to be pulling in different directions, affect your thinking.
It kind of is my thinking. I think that it's a little bit like race. I mean, I kind of don't like talking about it, but it's because it's thrust upon me. I mean, sometimes I think we talk about Black History Month and all these kind of things as if all Black history was a wonderful time. It wasn't. You know, Black history has its dictators and its, you know, massacres, and I don't want to live there. But we need to know about it and understand it so that we don't make the mistakes moving forward. And when it comes to the positive things, that we can show people that there's positive things. So I am fascinated with history because I come from, for a long time I was told that we didn't really have a history. You know, it started when we were discovered by Christopher Columbus or somebody, you know. And I think when I understood that actually I can do better than some people are telling me, as a Black person, I just kind of stood up with pride. I held my head up high. And then something strange happened. I went, knowing about these kings and queens and who had a baby with who and who fought who, is that really white history? And then I realized there was this, I'm not sure if you can use this term, excuse me if it's improper, but then I realized that there was this like white history that I didn't know about. And oddly, I realized that a lot of white people didn't know about it, you know? The real struggles of working class white people. I mean, more and more people are knowing about the suffragettes, but I didn't realize that there were women in Birmingham fighting against slavery. I didn't realize there were women in Birmingham that kind of would not have sugar because it came from the slave industry. I didn't realize there were people like Thomas Clarkson going around the country telling people that we could do trade with the Africans and not enslave them. I mean, all these things really fascinate me. I don't want to live there. I think it just tells us what's possible in the future. It reminds us of how change has come about. Powerful people don't give up their power. No, they're usually forced into it by a movement of grassroots people. So that fascinates me. But my real obsession is the future. And when it comes to Britain, a multicultural future where we just don't discriminate on grounds of gender and sex and race. Some people laugh at it and say that it'll never happen. Okay, it may make me a bit of a romantic, but I do believe we can live together. I believe in the victory of good over evil.
The alternative is not thinkable in so many ways.
Yeah.
And it's such a shame that idealism or romanticism or whatever you want to call it becomes a thing that people laugh at or dismiss as unrealistic.
If you think about the progress we've made so far, I reckon, you know, a couple of thousand years ago, this would have been idealistic.
Yeah.
You know. So.
I wanted to say something else, really, as we come to talk about Windrush Child. I don't know whether this was deliberate, but I was pleased to see that the book was published in November and not October. It lies outside Black History Month. And when I read it, I didn't feel I was reading this thing called Black history. I felt I was reading my history, our history. I wonder, is there anything that you would like to add to that kind of perspective, that it is our history and that we can all own it?
Well, I mean, I've always said that. I do things for Black History Month, but I wanted to do away with it. I mean, my friend, Linda Bellos, started it. She had a slightly different vision of it than what it turned out to be, but she started it. And I was there on the very first event. But what we wanted to do was make Black history just an integral part of all our histories. And so it was important for me that when Leonard comes to Manchester, that I give a really good literal view of what Manchester was like at the time. I mean, for example, the football team going down in the airplane crash that happened that year. It would have been crazy for me to write a story about somebody being in Manchester then and not including that. And I kind of enjoyed that element of it, researching it. What was it like for the British people then? And I just felt it was important to not make it a black book, for want of a better term. It's a story about a journey. If you read the book carefully, you see it talks about Irish migration as well. I mean, when I was growing up in Birmingham in the 60s and 70s, the immigrants that came just before us were the Irish. I remember I went to a very heavily Protestant school, and me and my twin sister, we really struggled a lot with racism there. And then one day I was walking from school and this little boy came behind me and he said, "Hey, I'll be your friend." And I said, "Why do you want to be my friend?" He said, "Well, before you came, they used to pick on me." I said, "Why did they pick on you?" He went, "Well, I'm Irish." And I just kind of went, "So you're white?" And he went, "I'm Catholic." And I just didn't understand it, And later on, when a Pakistani family came, we didn't get it so bad. The Pakistani family got it. Mm. So it's really a book about migration and about what happens to you when you go into a new place. And Leonard, although he suffers racism, he meets Fred, who he does his apprenticeship with, and they get on like a house on fire, and that was like, that's how I would have liked me and Robert to have grown up, this little Irish boy,
I'm going to talk about some of the characters in the book, but as you've talked about being approached by a young boy at school, Leonard is also, when he gets to school in Manchester, he's sort of befriended by a boy called Mark.
Yes.
That friendship turns sour. Mark makes the wrong choices in his life. It does show how easy it is to fall on one side of the fence or the other.
Yes. I mean, I think we've all had friends that we knew it could have gone in much better, but they've let you down, and there's something very fundamental about their character which you just cannot live with. Leonard thinks that this is a friend for life, if you like. But he lets him down. And this is, I guess, another one of my obsessions when I write fiction is that it's has some real truth to it. It comes from real life experience. And this has happened to me when I felt that somebody, as we kids like to say, we kids when I was a kid, he's got my back, kind of thing. And then I find that actually he hasn't. So I guess throughout Leonard's life, I just wanted to show the ups and downs you can go through, and the friend you can gain and the friend you can lose.
I mean, one of the most affecting relationships for me in the book is between his mother and father. And I think what I love in your writing is I do feel there's a veracity there without there being this overpowering authorial judgment. I mean, Leonard's father, we think that he's had an affair while Leonard's mother and he have been back in Jamaica. But it's just put there, we can see the emotional impact on all of the characters, but there's no real judgment about that.
There is something that happens in some communities, and they're kind of not really spoken about. I know that there were men that came over from the Caribbean. They left their wives in the Caribbean. They came here. They worked hard. They wanted to go out. They go out and dance with the local girls. It's slightly hush hush. But I just know lots of little stories about these kind of rendezvous and affairs, relationships, whatever you want to call them. And they're just, people need people. We get lonely. And sometimes it's not that we're bad people. We just want to go out. We want to, connect with other people, and things happen. And so, I didn't want to be too judgmental about it. I didn't want him to get away too lightly. And I wanted to show that, it does have consequences.
And you leave it to the reader to decide really what's gone on there. I think it's the father in the Irish family says to Leonard, it's life. And that's what it is, really. It's a human situation.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about language because in your foreword, you quite rightly say we're going to encounter some difficult words in the book. In fact, they weren't as difficult as I was anticipating. I think that they came across gollywog, which we don't hear much anymore, seems to be of that period. Wog was certainly used, that really felt awful. Coconut head was another. You don't use the N word anywhere in here. But language is something that I feel really strongly about, and it's something that people get really edgy about. So perhaps we could start by you just talking about some of the decisions you made and why you felt you needed to make them.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't use the N word because I didn't really grow up remembering it. Personally, it was never said to me. I had lots of other things said to me. I remembered wog.
Right.
I remembered, blackie, black bastard. And so I guess I used the words that I felt I heard without the effing and jeffing bit.
Interesting. I've got quite a few things that I want to, and they're genuine questions, because I think teachers who are our main listeners need to reflect on some of these issues. And the first one is something that's been reflected to me or said to me in the past, is that it's potentially damaging for children or young people who might not see themselves as objects of racism to discover themselves referred to that way in a book. What's your thought about that?
I've actually heard people and children and adults say, I don't think I've experienced racism. I mean, my mother to this day says she's never experienced racism. But yet, the scene in the book where the mother and Leonard is waiting in the shop to be served, and the lady comes and she says, "You're not going to serve that blackie before you serve me, are you?" That's exactly what happened to my mother. And when I said to my mother, I was just a little boy at the time, I said, "Mum, we were before her." Mum said, "Don't worry, she's in a hurry and it's her country." She kept making excuses. So to this day, she'll say that she never experienced racism. But if somebody says to me, I've never experienced racism and you're pushing this on me, you're making me think about the issue, I would say, well, you need to think about the issue because your brothers and sisters and your cousins and other people are. And if they are, you need to at least be aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Another question about language is really to do with teachers in schools who sometimes lack confidence to deal with it when it comes up in a book that they're reading. I've had books rejected on the basis of language before, and yet David Armand's Skellig would be one. That's not necessarily about racism, but I've had that book rejected on the basis of language. The word bollocks is used quite a lot in that. What sort of advice, though, do you give to teachers who might lack the confidence and feel that they shouldn't be reading a book that has words like this in it? How can we support them?
Oddly enough, I would say this. I think one of the ways of supporting them, if they're dealing with literature and books where the writer is alive and well and can talk about it, is to talk to the writer or look at YouTube interviews with the writer and talking about why he felt or he or she felt that it was important to put that in. I think it's not a good thing to present a view of the world which is a little bit sugar-coated, and especially with a lot of the kids that I know, is like, if you are giving them a book and it's happening, I don't know, in Peckham or something, and they're reading and they go, "That's not what Peckham sounds like." They just will not engage. They'll laugh at it. And so I think, the teachers have to try to be brave enough to say, this may not be how we live here in Orkney Islands. This may not be the language we use here, but this is the way they speak. This is the way they live in certain parts of the country, and put it into context. As a writer, especially a writer whose big obsession is the oral tradition, especially when it comes to my poetry, because I know my poetry is not the same written down as when it's spoken. I think it's kind of really important for people to hear me talking as much as possible about my work while I'm alive, because I want it to be put into context. So while I'm here, I can talk about the context. It's not simply, in my view, about bad language and swearing or anything like that. It's also about political context. I remember when I was at school, I was given a poem by Shelley, and the teacher just gave me the poem, walked away and said, "Read that poem and I'll be back in 10 minutes. Tell me what it's about." I didn't get the poem at all. I did not understand it at all. The language just seemed really odd. Now it's one of my favourite poems of all time, The Mask of Anarchy. You know, I didn't know Castlereagh was a prime minister. I didn't know that he was referring to slavery and all this stuff. If the teacher would have said, well, look, this is what was going on in the country at that time. You know, we had this kind of prime minister. We had people thinking they should continue with slavery, people thinking that we shouldn't, and all these things. And these are represented by all these beast heads in the poem. I would have gone, wow, you know, this is a rapper, you know what I mean? This is somebody that's like using language that's kind of relevant to the time, but it's also transferable to this time, and he's a militant and he's pushing language barriers, really. You know, it would have just got me excited. Context is really, really important. So that's what I would say to teachers, you know, context.
Yeah. This kind of touches on a similar theme. It's about Fred and what a lovely relationship those two have. There's a bit in the story where they finish work early for the day, they clear up their tools, and then they break into song and with their paintbrushes as microphones. And it's very joyous. And Fred takes on the accent of Leonard. He kind of imitates him. And there's quite a lot about who is allowed to do that and take on aspects or imitate or mimic somebody's culture. And it is difficult for people to know how to navigate all of that.
I think this is a real bit of distraction. And I do think people are just going over the top on this. As writers, we are appropriating all the time. If we don't, we just sit and write about ourselves. I mean, that's ridiculous. Can't I write female characters? Can't females write male characters? With my first novel, Faith, I purposely, everybody was expecting a Black Brixton novel from me, and I went out of my way to write a novel with a 15-year-old white character as the protagonist, you know. As creative people, we are borrowing all the time. I mean, I watched a beautiful program the other day on television about all these young Black people who are now starting to play classical music. Are we going to, you know, accuse them of cultural appropriation? You know, music belongs to all of us. But I do think, you know, if you talk to me about the black and white minstrels, I say, you know, what a horrible lot, because they were mocking. And I think that's the difference. For me, it's about the intention, and if you are not going to mock the accent or something like that in a way that is kind of putting the people down, that's one thing. But Fred I did a job painting and decorating once with lots of characters like Fred. So he's an amalgamation of a couple of people, and also a friend of mine who actually I write about in my autobiography called Philip Evans. He's alive and well now. And me and my brothers, when we were young, for a while, we started to get into Rod Stewart and Elton John and stuff like that. We just had this little phase where we're getting into, I guess we just used to watch Top of the Pops on Thursday night and stuff like that. Then we met this white kid called Philip Evans. He took us into his house and he played us all this Jamaican reggae music. And he was so passionate about it. And he knew all the words to Bob Marley's song. This is before Bob Marley was really famous, you know? And he, you know, his mother was white. He, you know, there wasn't a Black person in his family, but he just had this love for Jamaican music, and he could sing it all with the right accent and everything. And I just went, wow, what a guy. And we're still friends to this day. And so Fred is a bit of an amalgamation of my painter and decorating friends and my friend Philip Evans.
I'm going to pick up on the music that you've just talked about there. There's quite a lot of musical reference in your book, even if it's down to, you know, just the odd line of a song, "We Shall Not Be Moved." You immediately think of those protest songs, or ska music comes up quite a bit. I wonder whether, as a social activist and a campaigner as you are, whether you think music, dance and poetry have a particular role in bringing people together.
I have a message to you from Mr. Nelson Mandela. He said to me, anytime if somebody asks me that question, tell them to go and talk to him.
Right.
Yes, and I can't do that now. But for him, music was very, very important, because he knows that when they weren't getting anywhere politically with the struggle against apartheid, the musicians and the poets picked up the struggle. They didn't stop. And there's lots of other political struggles in the world as well where music has been important. Even something like rave music, which had very few lyrics on it. I mean, I write a lot of words in my music and I'm telling people to come together, black and white, unite and all that stuff. And that's what Bob Marley did. And that's what all these people did. Rave music comes along, hardly has any words in it, and brought so many people together. It is a wonderful thing. And when Leonard comes and they're playing songs like My Boy Lollipop, it gives them some pride because it's a Jamaican, but it's a big hit in England. And so it can be played in English dances. And now they can go out and meet English people who like that kind of music. And also, not just bringing people together, but as you alluded to, articulating the struggle in music through music. I mean, reggae music in particular does this really, really well. But if you look at some of the American early black gospel music, We Shall Not Be Moved, even taking Christian songs and making them relevant to the present day struggles, that's what Martin Luther King did. It's a very, very powerful thing. I guess this is just my theory, that if we sat down now, or we had a talk in a normal prose way, if that's the right way of putting it, you may remember a little bit here and there, but you won't remember all of it. But if I put it in the form of a poem or a song, even though you don't know the details, you will know, I have a dream that one day black and white people will sit down together. You will know, we shall not be moved. Free Nelson Mandela. You don't know the verses, free Nelson Mandela. It kind of places the music, the poem, in your memory. And when you're standing together on a protest demonstration, march or whatever, with people alongside you who you've never met before, you can join together in song or poem.
Really true. One last question. I feel that I could talk to you for hours and we'd only touch the surface. But one last question in terms of what sorts of books you'd like to see in the future. I would love to see a book about Rastafarianism for children. I'd love to see a book about Bob Marley for children. What are the gaps that you see and that you would love to see published for young people?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned those two things, because Rastafarianism is a particular thing because it doesn't have a leader. People have tried to study it and they get very frustrated because there's no Rastafarian book, and Rastafarianism can be so diverse. Bob Marley, I think one of Bob Marley's kids wrote a book, a children's book about a Rasta family. Sorry, I can't remember the title. I guess there's so many books that I would like to see. I'll tell you what I'd really like to see. I'd like to see a book about the black servants, slaves that were in Britain. I'd like to see a lot more about before Windrush, but certainly those very early people that came over almost as pets. Sounds a bit harsh, but that's how they were viewed. And sometimes they appear in the corner of a painting or something like that. I would like to see a little bit more written about those characters.
Well, Benjamin Zephaniah, it has been such an illuminating journey talking to you today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. You take care.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.